magic, cauldrons, brooms, and pointy black hats. What springs to mind when you think of these items? Witches. But did you know that the modern-day stereotype of these mysterious individuals originates from the 16th century, when witch hunts were an increasingly common and tragic part of everyday life? The history of witches and witchcraft in England is much darker than you may think, and the stories of hundreds of innocent people, mostly women but sometimes men, is one of persecution, torture, and tremendous suffering, which far too often ended in tragedy. During the 16th century, the majority of society genuinely believed that witches and other mystical beings were real, and that everyone was at risk of falling victim to their supposedly wicked ways. This idea of protecting oneself against such evil entities was so prevalent that many households performed a nightly shutting in, where the master of the household would routinely bolt doors and lock windows to protect himself and his family from whatever may be lurking in the darkness outside. Whilst witch hunts did occur in Western Europe during this period, it wasn't until the late 16th century that the frenzied witch hunts that would later infect the shores of England took hold. By the late 1580s, King James VI of Scotland was in his early 20s and on the lookout for a suitable bride, and his choice fell upon the young Anne of Denmark. Shortly following their marriage by proxy, Anne set sail for Scotland. However, her convoy of ships were battered by a terrible storm, which sunk one ship and very nearly capsized Anne's. Ultimately, the conditions were deemed too dangerous, and the group headed for refuge on the nearby coast of Norway. Upon hearing this news, James VI decided to fetch his new bride himself, and shortly after arriving in Norway, was informed that a group of local women had confessed to conjuring up the terrifying storm with the intention of killing his young bride. The Scottish Witchcraft Act of 1563 had already made witchcraft a capital offence. However, this particular encounter sparked an interest in James VI, later also King James I of England, and culminated in the publication of his book Demonology, published in 1597, which endorsed witch hunts. Life was hard in early modern Europe. A mini ice age had killed off crops, many people were hungry, and for those living in small, rural communities outside the major towns and cities, it was becoming increasingly difficult to make ends meet. It was during this time, when the turbulent English Civil War was in full swing, that an Englishman by the name of Matthew Hopkins appeared on the scene. He was a self-declared witch-finder, who was often invited into these small rural communities by concerned and suspicious villagers, who believed that a witch lived among them and was responsible for their misfortunes. If the crops failed, villagers blamed witches. If it rained for days and days without stopping, they believed that was the work of a witch too. And if a woman owned a cat, or even a broom, she was in very real danger of being accused as being a witch and tortured into making a confession by Hopkins. Hundreds of women were forcibly taken from their homes, imprisoned, and placed under observation to see if their familiar, that is, a small half-animal, half-demonic entity which served as a witch's magical aid, would appear. And when this didn't happen, their bodies would then be searched for any witch marks left behind by their familiar, giving away their true identity, but was actually nothing more than a skin blemish. In reality, Hopkins relied on methods such as sleep deprivation to force these scared and exhausted women into a false confession. When that didn't work, Hopkins then turned to his sink or swim test, note the origin of expression, where the hands and feet of his victims were bound together and they were thrown into a nearby lake or river. It was commonly believed that a witch would be quickly rejected by the purity of the waters and swim to the surface, whereas the innocent would sink and drown. 16th century England was a patriarchal society, which left many women vulnerable to the likes of Hopkins, and who tragically met an untimely death during his horrific witch hunts. However, over time, opposition to Hopkins' methods of extracting supposed confessions was gaining momentum. He later fell out of favour, and in August 1647, the Witchfinder General died after a short illness. Ultimately, the Hopkins witch hunts were responsible for the deaths of over 100 innocent people in England who were sentenced to death and hanged for a crime they didn't commit. A local woman who lived alone, owned herbs, remedies, or even possessed a basic knowledge of medicine was accused of being a witch and making a pact with the devil, when in reality, innocent and vulnerable people were used as a scapegoat for the everyday misfortunes experienced by those around them.